Hi, so I just want to say big thank you, first of all, to everybody who's subscribed to Iron Age Amps and expressing interest in the channel. I honestly didn't think that it'd be going as quickly as it is, but the whole reason that, myself and my wife to be are actually starting this business is because in New England, there's not really as much, or especially in Maine, which is where we're from, it's harder to find people who are willing to get inside of an amp and help you find those tones that you're looking for. And specifically, I'm looking for a lot of stuff that's from, you know, 30, 40 years ago and 3,000 miles away. I've never been able to play a vintage Marshall, Plexi Super Lead, an old school JCM 800. I remember back a few years ago when I started getting into this, just drooling over these vintage amps that had been, for lack of a better word, magical. So there's something about these tonal characteristics that you hear, and even if it is a compressed video on the internet, it's just closer to those sounds that you hear in your favorite records, but also the idealized version of that being the tone that you hear in your head. So I started experimenting. Opening up one of my first tube amps was actually a Friedman PT20. It was so loud for 20 watts, and I spent all this money on it, and it still wasn't doing what I wanted it to. So I went back in and I started learning about, how to safely discharge an amp, first of all, but, plate, cathode, grid, and just designing a preamp. And then from there, I got a JTM 45 amp kit, and I put a 4 gain stage amp with a tube rectifier, and it's cool, a little unstable, but that'll be another story for another time. So lately, I've been doing a lot of videos that were a Marshall JCM 800 power section, but a 50 watt EL34 power section, and I decided to go in and figure out ways to get those tones that you want to hear, again, at a bedroom level. And unfortunately, I've also never played a Jose modded Marshall, but again, those tones are really awesome. But the more I started learning about them, and when I actually did implement my own diode clipping option, I felt that it still wasn't quite what I was looking for. And I've heard other people say that too. So I was like, okay, let's put a tube buffered effects loop in so I get some delay and reverb, and that's awesome. And again, super warm sounding, it's a tube. No solid state components, no giant resistors dropping voltage to power that solid state effects loop. Then I added that 4th gain stage in. So now at a much lower volume, I can get that upper mid-range frequency, that snarling bark and bite or whatever, and it's so close to what I heard in my head and what I was hearing on my favorite, Dokken records and the early Aussie stuff. Diary of a Madman is a huge source of inspiration for my tone searching and just reigniting my love of heavy metal again when I was 18. It was always a big part of my life, actually, when I was much younger. And then I got back into classic rock and death metal when I was 19. And eventually I came all the way back to Van Halen and hair metal, and I was like, wow, there is something about this guitar tone that I have not been able to find, and quite frankly, I cannot afford a $4,000 or $5,000 amp. I can't afford an attenuator on top of that, plus all the other gear that I want to get. So my whole philosophy is trying to lower the cost to build an amp head, and I actually have gone back further in time. I took a look at the inside of a 1950s Gibson amp. I think it might have been called a Skylark, and someone described it as the backbone of the amp, but it was all these terminal strips and point-to-point wiring. And there's a lot of great guys and great amps out there that are all turret board based and amazing sounding amps. They're also PCB based. But I wanted to be able to just have that home brewed feeling that, you go onto eBay or something and you see that amp with the mysterious labels on it and you're like, oh man, if only I had, $4,500 to spend, or I had a garage in the middle of nowhere where I could actually turn the thing up to where it sounded awesome. So I've been on a quest to lower headroom, but also get the sustained compression that people want using all tube-based circuitry. And it's fascinating the further I get into this. And I just want to say, awesome community out there. Jason Tong from Headfirst Amps, huge resource. Ground Zero Ampworks, I just want to say thank you so much just for any correspondence. I really appreciate it. And again, all the people who are showing interest in the channel and what we're trying to do here, I'm incredibly grateful. I just want to take away the exclusivity of tube amps and that options paralysis of searching for guitar tone. And I want to help people the way I helped myself initially. So, I know it can be frustrating. I feel like I've spent so much money in the past on things that don't sound the way I want to, or going after a tone and you learn that, there's also all the compression in the studio and the mic EQs and the placement. And you're like, oh man, I still am not getting that sound. So I try to go back and experiment with, again, different material types, how the circuit is laid out, how much bass frequency is there. I've recently taken the depth mod out, and I think I've talked about that before. But there's an interesting video I watched from a gentleman named B. Hosterman on YouTube, and he was actually talking a lot about his, I believe it was a Mark Cameron modded Marshall, and how he rolls the depth knob back and actually has a bunch of bass frequency taken back as well. So I started to think about that more when designing the preamp, and I was genuinely surprised at how percussive, tight, and how much low end was actually there. I mean, another good example is if you look at Yngwie Malmsteen, his EQ setup is, his bass knob is at 0. And I think he boosts his mids and he has some of the treble at 3 or 2. It's a really interesting setup. But again, just looking at how guitar players have gone after those tones, like Boston is another good example of using a mid boost in the effects loop. So I said, geez, Marshall has mid-range tonality emphasis. Why is it people still need to use an EQ pedal to get there? So I'm trying to figure out how I can emphasize those frequencies and getting closer. And eventually we are going to try and improve our recording setup. So bear with us here. We really appreciate it. Music is what drives us. It drives me. Keeps us going, especially in a strange and ever-changing world out there. Why not play some of our favorite tones in our bedroom at home? Not all of us can go into a studio with our expensive rack gear and our vintage tubes that were Brimar or made in England. If it sounds good with JJ 12AX7s, then it's probably a solid circuit. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Even more stuff to come. Again, I just want to knock those doors down and just share all this with everybody else. Thank you so much.